Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome. Just to confirm you're in the right place, and welcome to our Creating the Conditions, putting communities at the heart, in conversation with Cormac Russell, Pam Green, and Stuart Long. We're just going to make sure that everyone has arrived that wanted to arrive, so just bear with me. But my name's Jason Fergus. I'm going to be your host this afternoon. So just bear with me, and I'll do some introductions and a little bit of housekeeping. So. Welcome. And what a lovely day. Isn't it nice to see the sun out? Doesn't the sun make us all feel good? Excellent. I love it. Absolutely love it. But hopefully an encouragement to make sure we get out and do some physical activity as well. So yeah, it's great to see the sun out. We've missed the sun for a very long time. So good afternoon and welcome. I have the pleasure of being your host this afternoon. My name is Jason Fergus and I'm Director at Active Ethics. I'm delighted to introduce our second in the series of creating the conditions here at Active Ethics, and this one very much and importantly titled is Putting Communities at the Heart. And we all know, and I know that's why you're all here as well this afternoon, but absolutely communities are so critical and very much the backbone of our society. And actually we really want to make sure that we're placing them in this great place called Essex at the heart of fostering that resilience, that inclusivity, and of course contributing to that well-being of our community and places as well. This afternoon, I'm delighted that we're going to explore actually how we empower communities, but critically kind of build strong relationships and create environments where everyone can thrive. And I know looking at the list of people that have accepted to come to this afternoon, there's some amazing people who've got some amazing stories as well. So I know that there's some really exciting things going on here across this great place called Essex. So big thank you to what you're doing already. And hopefully we'll be able to hear some of your questions and comments a little bit later on in this session. But let me take the opportunity to introduce our three speakers this afternoon. Firstly, I'm delighted to introduce Cormac Russell. Cormac Russell, I suppose the best way to describe as part of being a friend, actually, and we've worked with Cormac now for a good 6-7 years now, but very much a social explorer, I think I'd like to describe Cormac as, actually, and just delighted that we're able to anchor some time with Cormac, because Cormac absolutely is an international traveller with his thought leadership in the space around asset-based community development, but more critically, I suppose, recognising the impact and the benefit that communities can have to a place and to a society as well. And so I'm delighted that Cormac's going to kick us off shortly with kind of putting some of those conditions that we want to think about in this really important journey. He's also written a recent book, or not so recent now because I've got it as well actually, with co-author John McKnight, called Discovering the Connected Community and Discovering the Health, Wealth and Power of Neighbourhoods. And I have got a copy, Cormac, and I have read it, and I do encourage people to do read that book actually, because I learn a hell of a lot actually, Cormac. So a huge thank you to that as well. So well done on that. Let me introduce our second speaker, and delightful to introduce Pam Green. Pam Green, Alliance Director in Brentwood and Basildon, and Pam is absolutely passionate about delivering thriving neighbourhoods, and I suppose building on people's strength and communities that live locally. And I suppose Pam's got this inept ability to absolutely recognise the value in people, and in particular the voluntary sector, and place partners in this really important journey we're on around how we're creating the conditions for people to be active and healthy in their space. Pam absolutely takes that literally as well. And so, you know, Pam, I remember a conversation with Pam only a couple of years ago saying, Pam, we've got Ride London coming and I need someone to raise some money for our charity. Would you do it? And Pam, not once, but twice, did Ride London, travelling 100 miles out of London into Essex and back again. And so Pam absolutely has that huge, not just passionate and love, but that can-do attitude, Pam. So thank you for joining me this afternoon, and it's great to see you as well. And finally, Stuart Long. Stuart Long has the pleasure, and I call it a pleasure, Stuart, I hope you'll agree with me, as being Chief Exec of ATF. And ATF stands for Achieve, Thrive and Flourish. And ever since I've known Stuart has absolutely been so passionate about communities and changing people's lives. Stuart used to work in a local authority and absolutely stopped all of that to set up something that he's passionate and believes that wants to and is making a huge difference actually, and really creating that kind of strong sense of communities with trusted colleagues and trusted people. And I'm delighted that here at Active Ethics we've seen ATF grow from strength to strength. But more importantly, Stuart just to say publicly that we absolutely recognise you as a true locally trusted organisation and the amazing work that you're doing. So a huge thank you to you as well. So what we'd like to do this afternoon is we're going to ask Cormac shortly to kick off and give us, as I said, his thought leadership in this space actually and what this means. We're then going to ask Pam and Stuart to share their reflections on a more local basis actually on some of the things that Cormac will share with us. But I suppose your part today is to be curious, is to listen, I'm sure, and really be, hopefully, make you think about actually what you might want to put in the chat as a comment, but critically, we also want to hear your questions as well. And you'll see on the top of the screen, there's a question and answer function. Please write in your questions because we're going to make sure, my job is to make sure we have enough time to allow these three speakers to answer some of your questions that I'm sure that you might have that might be provoked through this session this afternoon. So that, I want to pause there from me. Delighted now, Cormac, to introduce you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and great to have an opportunity as well to share a conversation with my friends and colleagues. Pam, and particularly, the work that she does has always been to the forefront of my mind whenever I think of sharing stories outside the UK, and Stuart as well. So there's a lot of great stuff already happening. So this is less about telling folks what they ought to do locally because the genie is out of the bottle, I think, in Essex in all kinds of ways, and more about just thinking about what else might be possible as we grow on what I think has been a great success story, actually. And Jason, in no small part, I think, credit to you and your team as well in that regard. So look, in terms of thinking about the question of creating conditions, and many people here will be thinking about how can we animate communities in tough times. And there are lots of things to be concerned about as well as be hopeful about as we look to the future. So I just wanted to share some ideas really for about 20 minutes or so. Hopefully some of them at least will land. And then I think more importantly, to hear your ideas. As Jason said, please do use the chat function, do ask questions and disagree. We're not looking for agreement here. We're looking for insight, and challenge is important too. So feel free to challenge. That we have broad shoulders. We're quite welcome to, be disagreed with and so forth. But let me start. So I often think of, what have we learned across about a generation? So it's been about a generation, nearly 20 odd years, 21, maybe 22 years since we had the heat wave in Europe that claimed the lives of 70 people. The climate has increasingly gotten warmer, and as well as climate challenges, we have many other challenges that we face about a generation on since that. So the question is, what have we learned? And I think it's interesting because it seems to me that there's still a lot that we have to accept that hasn't quite landed when it comes to dealing with issues like climate, or when it comes to dealing even with bigger political issues, and indeed some of the challenges around race equity. We saw spill out into riots during the summer this year. And the heart of the matter is, I think, where we have a real challenge, and maybe where there's a little bit of stuckness in France and in the UK, the US, particularly Australia and different parts of the world that I'm working in, is I think we still have a lot of people stuck in what I call story one. And story one, you can see my gift is not art, but story one is illustrated here in this slide by this idea that, if we just get people and we figure out what's wrong with them or what they need or what they're missing, and then we try our best to sort of formulate a programmatic intervention, that things will get better. So it's what I call the institutional assumption. For every problem, there's an institutional solution. And there may well be, and I think Stuart's work is important here as well. You will not get to a point where people will thrive and flourish simply by unilaterally providing services or programs. It just doesn't work. It's quite ironic. There's all the science around human significance theory now and flourishing theory is very clear in saying people can be healthy and languish, and they can be sick and flourish. We often confuse these things. We often think that health is the absence of sickness. Well, it's that to an extent, but it's not just that. It's flourishing, it's thriving. And actually, most of the time, people thrive not just because they've been well serviced, but because they have purpose, meaning, contribution, and they've got good services and enough money to have a good life. So it's a complex feast of possibilities. One of the difficulties with the kind of narrative that assumes our health is in the hands of a doctor, our child's education's in the quality of the classroom teachers, or our safety is in the hands of police, see it, say it, sort it. Well, those kinds of narratives actually depoliticize the power of community. They basically say your job is to be passive, or if you're active, it's to report to the right institution. And sometimes that argument is fine, but it doesn't solve everything. There are whole ranges of things for which the best solutions are found when communities are at the heart of those solutions, not as passive recipients or even satisfied recipients of services just, but also as people who are making visible maybe sometimes what isn't very visible, which is their agency, their passion, their capability, and let's put it on the table as well, their anger. It may be that they're angry with the way certain things are going, or they're saying no to certain things, like, for example, hate crime or extremism. So the question when we think about putting community at the heart of whatever it is that matters is how do we make visible what's often invisible in community life as people are busy trying to make ends meet or busy trying to just figure out how they're going to get through the day or living with trauma or just going to work or volunteering or whatever it might be. How do you get to a better story? Because story one is impoverished. Of course, we need services, but it's not sufficient. So, what I propose we're learning, and I think in a lot of ways we're seeing in your local context, is what happens when you have a more fulsome picture, where number one, you're definitely remaining person-centered, but you're not just putting a person at the center of your conversation and then just defining them by their deficiency. You're also seeing them by their gifts, by their contributions, by their capabilities, by their power, by their agency, by their voice. So we're not just talking about distributive justice, where we get people the resources they need. We're also talking about participative justice, about procedural justice, where people have voice and choice, and also restorative justice, because harm has been done to communities. Failures have been made, missteps have occurred in the past, and reconciliation is required. We see increasingly across the UK that one of many reasons why people of colour are not using services in some communities is because they don't trust the NHS. They do not trust the professionals. It's as simple as that. Don't take it personally, but we have to look at the structural issues that have created that, because there are reasons, good reasons they have for that. So how do we get in conversation? Well as seeing people as contributors in their own right, we also have represented in those circles associations, clubs, groups, informal networks of people in every neighborhood who are hugely, hugely important. If you were to take the vital signs of a neighborhood, you would be asking how many associations exist in that neighborhood and how often do those associations work together. The stronger the associational life of a neighborhood is, the greater the level of neighborhood cohesion, community power, and community belonging there will be. If those three things are in place in every neighborhood, then when you do get to the triangles, the institutional stuff, the not-for-profit, governmental, non-governmental stuff, then it adds value to that. So you see here the way I've drawn this pictured story too, they're still agency, programmatic, service-based interventions, but they supplement community power rather than supplant it. So they're there as backup. Sometimes we have to step forward and we have to be at the forefront of change, as we had to during COVID and at times of crisis. But over and over again, we also have to recognize that if community are not at the heart of what we do, well, then we can only go so far. There are limits to what institutions can do. And that's why the opposite of putting community at the heart of your work is to claim that institutions have a monopoly on all the best solutions. And I don't know about you, but I don't think the idea that we should expect communities to unilaterally have monopoly on our health or our justice or our security or whatever else, I don't think that's a good idea. Because aside from the fact we'll fail, I think we'll also burn out our colleagues. So there's a simple idea here, and the idea is that it's a misuse of power to solve problems that don't belong to institutions. But if we can get the right alignment between what institutions do so well and what communities do so well, I think we can actually open up not alone a lot better response to the current issues, but we can build a huge amount of anti-fragility into how we lean forward into the future. Let me give you some examples. So this is a 700-year story from Geel, which is in Birmingham. And it's a story about how the community are actually working with people with mental health issues, not in a service-related way, but actually inviting people with mental health challenges to be guests in the lives of families in Geel. It's a really interesting model because what it does is it puts community at the heart of mental health, which is often something we think of as a service-related competency. They've got 40 nurses, there's about 30,000 people in the town of Geel, and they've got 40 nurses that work almost like in a Buurtzorg way, so they're self-managed, they're local teams, they just work there, but they're supporting the person, the family, and the wider community to forge connections. It's one of the few models that I've ever seen that genuinely places community at the center of how we support people who are experiencing distress and overwhelm in their lives to go on their journey of recovery. And certainly all of the study that I've done in this space tells me community has a healing power. It's a prophylactic when it comes to this and really has supported people in their journey around mental health. It's interesting because basically what we're seeing here as well is that the institutions are important. Of course they are, and services and, Talking Cure and so forth, really important, but they supplement rather than supplant the interventions. In many experiences of mental health and psychiatric intervention in the UK, what people experience is actually the loss of community connections as they go deeper into intervention. And what we should be seeing is actually that those connections are actively being supported. So the question is, if we're in a situation where we're professionally thinking about some of these services, what are we doing to precipitate social connections? And maybe the other question is, if we're doing harm to those connections, how might we actually decelerate and stop that? The reason I think this is so important is because the evidence tells us it is. And many of you are perhaps coming from different agendas. Some of you are interested in employment, others safety, others health, and others maybe different things in between. But the evidence is really clear. So the ONS labour market trends tell us very clearly that people are 4 times more likely to find a job if they have strong social connections. So we all know this. People, it's not about what you know. It's about who you know, who knows who you need to know to actually get to mainstream employment. Neighbourhood safety, which is a very big issue, I think, for many of us on this call. Again, we know now that more police do not equate to greater levels of safety. It can help in some instances, but it's not the only solution. That actually the more people at neighbourhood level know each other by first name and are active. We talk about active here, active, thriving, flourishing. Stuart will be talking about that later. Active really matters, that they're actively involved in growing their community from inside out. That's what creates safety. Caring about your neighbours' safety. Being involved in doing things together. Creating those conditions where I know at least 10 of my neighbours by first name and we do stuff together. That's what creates safety. So in many respects, this is probably most evident when we look at health. We're told that living in supportive communities is really good for your health. Well, the science is now telling us it's actually likely to improve your health outcomes by about 27%. And there are various stats on this, some which are now saying if you're not a member of a club or a group and you join an association and become active, you reduce your chances of dying prematurely in the next year by anywhere between 39 and 50%. I know of no drug that's even being developed in pharmacology at the moment that can compete with those kinds of stats. These are phenomenal. Not too far away, we think of, the various counties across the UK, friends of ours who are, learning and growing along with us. Somerset's a good example, but again, when we look at this between 2015 and 18 in Somerset, there was a 29% increase in emergency hospital admissions. But at the same time, in the small town of Frome, that went down by 17%. So a differential of nearly 50% there. What was happening? What were they doing in Frome that they weren't doing in other places in Somerset? Well, it's simple. They were growing community. They were putting community relationships at the heart. And the point about this is that so often people think and they assign health to the doctor and the arena to the hospital. But here, a new story is flourishing, and it's a story that says actually health is also at the heart of community. It's about living the life of the local. Doesn't solve everything. And of course, I've had sick children. You're more than grateful as a parent when the right kind of medical intervention comes to bear. I am not asking my neighbors to do heart surgery on my child. Of course not. That would be a silly argument. So we're not saying that community is at the heart of things like that is where we're going. But there are things that my neighbors did while my children were sick for my family and my kids that I wouldn't expect the surgeon to come and live next door to us and do either. So this is about how we're actually lining up. Okay. And I think one of the difficulties is at times not very well is the answer. So much of our budgets are going to the acute ends of our healthcare systems, our policing systems, our prison systems, our education systems, so that by the time we actually get to do the preventative and developmental stuff, there's only the crumbs from the captain's table left. And it's not that this is very expensive to do, but it isn't just going to happen. We do need to apportion some kind of investment to enable particularly communities that have become quite atomized and where there's issues of fear or maybe issues of poverty to deal with. I thought, we don't have a huge amount of time here, so I don't want to take up too much more, but just a couple of quick stories. So one example that really tickled me was an example from Singapore where they've introduced a kind of a different mental model. So here you see in this cartoon, the psychologist, all they can see is the symptom. And that's often so much the case, they miss the actual challenge, which is deforestation. So one of the things that they're doing in Yishun, which is a very significant part of Singapore, is they're decentralizing. So any staff that are non-essential medical staff are being decentralized to work at neighborhood level. And when they're there, when they're out of the hospital and they're living the life of the local, they're also democratizing. What does that mean? Well, it means they're not doing for communities what they can do for themselves. So they're not there setting things up for communities, but they're finding out what communities want to do and then helping them get organized to do it. So if people want to start a Tai Chi group, they support them to do that. They remove the barriers to participation. Maybe they need a little bit of funding. Maybe they need a place to meet, but they do not run the Tai Chi program for the community. They find people in the community who've got the skills, or maybe with a little bit of light touch training would have the skills to lead that. Why? Because if you own and you lead and you've got autonomy, that's good for your health. It leads to greater flourishing. You thrive. And when the money disappears, as so often it does, we saw with USAID just a few weeks ago, that calamitous situation where all around the world now money has been taken literally overnight from people. Is there a resilient way of responding to that? For lots of people, no. They've become dependent on that, and there's no other way now to respond. So how do you democratize? How do you build the carrying capacity, both so that communities can hold their funders to account if, the political winds blow in a different direction, but also so they can build that social capital and take things forward. They've also disintermediated. I'm going to stop on just shortly because I want Pam and Stuart to come in on this because I know you'll have a lot to say. But I think this one particularly, I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on. I think what we saw, and we've seen this in a lot of places, I see it a lot in the UK, there's a lot of mediating going on. So there's a lot of stuff where agencies, for-profit, not-for-profit, third sector and public sector, are coming in, really good folks, but they're doing great mediation, and then they're not so great at kind of stepping back and supporting the community to have more voice and space to really begin to take the lead themselves. So it's almost like, what I'm seeing is, I think we come in with ideas around how to make things better to communities. And then if we're progressive, we ask if we can work with them. But what we're not seeing an awful lot of is where we're creating the conditions where the communities themselves come up with their ideas, and then they invite us as appropriate to be guests in their lives, and we work with them. So it's almost like we always almost take the lead too soon, and then we're left carrying the baby, So because we just haven't done the developmental work very well. So disintermediating was where we started training the staff in Yishun in Singapore how to step back just a little bit to enable that authority to really be relocated to the heart of community. And I think that's a really important piece. Do we feel strong? Do we feel we have agency? Do we feel we're at the heart of change? If the answer is no in our neighborhoods, well, then who really is holding the reins here? And it's often the answer is institutions. And so I think the final thing that they've done is really to actively work on diminishing this story one that I talked about, which says, that institutions can unilaterally solve all problems, and really enlarge this less common story too, which says actually, if community are not at the heart of how we're making change happen in the areas that matter most to us, then the likelihood is that institutions on their own will fail. I think I'll stop there because I've talked for roughly about 20 or so minutes. And I'd love to just maybe to start with handing over to Pam and then Stuart. And then I think Jason's going to moderate questions and get us into a bit of a conversation. So Jason, I hope I haven't overstepped.
By nothing less. You can never do that for me, Cormac. Actually, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And you've kind of set us up very nicely, actually. And certainly you gave quite a few cues in there for Pam and for kind of Stuart. So I suppose I want to start with Pam, actually. And I suppose, Pam, excitingly, some really strong health narrative coming out of Cormac today, wasn't there, Pam, actually? And just really keen to hear your perspective, actually, as a senior leader in our health landscape here in Greater Essex. Yeah. How does that feel? What did that sound like to you? And how would you play that back, actually, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. And let me just say it's an absolute privilege to be on the same stage as Cormac Russell. I owe a huge amount of my development over recent directorial years to Cormac's influence and that through the local delivery pilot of Sport England and Active Essex support. So I would not be here without those interventions, and my practice would not have changed. I'm a physiotherapist by profession, and I very proudly called myself an evidence-based practitioner. When I came out of university, and I had that kind of view of the world that because I was highly trained, I should be the one giving out advice to people and they should follow it. One of the most sort of transformational days of my life was when a patient just said to me, I don't do your exercises, don't you? Yeah, probably. Yeah, I do. And sort of went into the conversation about why not. Well, because I find them boring. Yes, but I'm the evidence-based practitioner that's given you this. Why would you not listen to me? I'm giving you my knowledge. And they said, but if you could make out that I could go and play a violin and go to a violin group, some sort of musical group. I've had a stroke. My life has changed. I'm isolated. I think I'd do that. And it feels like that would make a big difference to me. And that about 5 years of my life trying to get a personal budget and get somebody removed from statutory services to do something that was sustainable in their life and gave them connection, gave me the passion to try and break down barriers. And it was so difficult. And actually, inevitably, we ended up getting that person funded through voluntary sector to get to access that resource. The establishment just couldn't move its mindset into delivering an intervention in a very, very different way. And listening to Cormac, having the absolute privilege to have spent so much time with him and work through the LDP, I suppose what I have done is absolutely step back. And I now understand the distrust that a badge and a title actually generates. And we have a set of phrases in the areas that I've worked, and Stuart, I'm sure, will use some of them as well. But everything goes at the speed of trust, and actually if I go in and break trust, nothing in the community will work, because I have huge influence, but it's not always positive, because we have money, and as commissioners, we can destroy infrastructure so quickly. And the minute you start to get, as a leader, more humble in that space, you're less dangerous. And actually, we should do a bit of a risk assessment on ourselves as to how dangerous we are, because that's not leadership language that we talk about, but actually unintended consequences of the decisions that we make. If you don't employ this sort of practice, actually, it's really important to communities. We ride in, we try and solve a problem because we're under political pressure, we decimate the infrastructure around us, and then we ride off again to our middle class lives and leave nothing behind. And that is practice that I can't condone. So in my decision making, in my inquiry, in my curiosity, is what do we leave behind us? What is the legacy? The first thing I always do in working on a project is asset mapping, because actually, unless you know the micro infrastructure of your communities, you don't know if you're damaging it or not. So they're principles that Cormac has taught us, and the benefits of working with active ethics and trusted partners have enabled us to have trust within our communities, but not. I don't feel the need to be that person in the community. I've got such a trusted network working with Stuart, and I hope he talks about it. But the things that we've been able to do with general practice and primary care around having a different conversation is phenomenal. And I'll always go back to that Robert Wood Johnson model of 80% of what makes somebody well is actually nothing to do with health. 20% of the statutory services that we commission are there to pick up the pieces when the rest of it has not worked. And that might be, opportunities in skills and economic stability. Safety is such a massive part of that. If you're running on cortisol constantly, one of our other colleagues, with Dr. William Bird, will tell you about the physical effects of that. The physical endocrine effects of that means that the GPs that I work with are constantly having to prescribe more medication. The minute you start prescribing more, people feel less well and actually start to disengage from physical activity because they're managing their hydration or not able to manage their hydration. They're struggling. They're adapting to the side effects of medication is not a simple process for people. So the medication is not the route. We've got to create the conditions there for people to be healthy. Active travel, being safe when you're traveling, all of those things reduce the impact on health, but they're not directly in my responsibility. So how do I work with a network of partners to share the health narrative with me, and how do I share the safety narrative for them is part of system leadership. But having a different conversation is something that Stuart and his team have really enabled us to have with general practice, and embedding staff from Stuart's team into the front door of a GP practice to be social prescribers, to have a wider connection, somebody that's connected to the school, somebody that can recognise the subtle symptoms of domestic violence, someone that can ask something in a safe way where they don't think that there's going to be a social worker brought in or a conversation about the safety of their children, actually changes the level of trust in the work that we do completely. So I would like just to talk about injustice as well, because I think the minute we start to think through an injustice lens, actually, as commissioners, it changes your practice to another level. And being completely embedded with communities where you can be, not for publicity stunts, not for anything that changes, the organisational reputation, but for your own efficacy. If you don't embed with communities in a way that you don't go there with your badge on, you won't learn enough to know whether there is injustice or not in your communities. And racial injustice for me is something that I'm very, very passionate about. And I think having the opportunity to deploy health inequalities money through commissioning organisations, if you don't challenge around inequality from a racial perspective, actually you haven't started the journey, because it is such a symptom of broken statutory organisations and thought processes that they leave people behind. Communities are not hard to reach. They're absolutely not hard to reach. We just don't go and discover enough. And the discovery days that Stuart has done with some of the most challenged communities in my part of Essex have given us so much intelligence that has changed the way that we've thought about the provision of services completely. And that's humbling, and you absolutely have to be receptive to that as a leader, and you have to be authentic, and not because that's what books tell you to do, because actually if you're not, the community will sniff it out very, very quickly, and you'll get caught out, and then guess what, the trust goes backwards again. So actively investing in voluntary sector, actively bringing them to the table, giving a wider seat at the table, thinking about deep levels of democracy in everything that you do, and the voices on the edge is so critical. I remember from my first ever asset-based community development training, keep a welcome at the edges is a phrase that I have never ever forgotten. Stay, linger longer, and let that happen, because wanting to do these things on a quick fix will always give you the same loud voices, and you'll never change the rhetoric. So be brave in that space, ask for a bit more time, because the outcome can be absolutely phenomenal.
Wow, I want you to carry on. Cormac, I want you both to carry on. This is absolutely fantastic stuff. And Cormac, it was so fascinating. Pam absolutely brought to life your 4Ds. She just absolutely smashed it, didn't she? In the sense of, you talked about, didn't you, the importance of kind of that disintermediate piece, the fact that actually communities are let them communicate those ideas. Pam, as a commissioner, in the position she's in, I think Cormac just gave you a new slide, didn't she?
I agree. No, it's great. And I think the grounding of it, Pam, is really important, actually, because when people, as you know too, Jason, like when I present, I'm presenting at kind of a broad level. But I think when people like Pam come in then and say, look, we've done it, this is how we're doing it, and it's working, that really is a very powerful message. But then to add on top of that some really good insight about how to do it, because I think practice matters. So whether it's commissioning or procurement, or you're a practitioner on the ground, there's good guidance there for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm going to get to Stuart, but I'm just so excited because I don't want to forget these points, Pam, because you've got my mind on sweet. You said risk assessment of organisations we should do. And I love that point, because what you're trying to say is that if we want to avoid the 4Ds, which we've just learned about from Cormac, we need to be mindful of ourselves, actually, and how we behave and how we act. Because actually, sometimes I think you're saying, are we the blocker? Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think statutory organisations perform in a certain way that actually the rhetoric, it's very difficult to challenge the rhetoric. It's very difficult to challenge the way decisions are made sometimes. And the culture of an organisation means that is either possible or impossible. And actually deployment of funds and the way that we do it can just have so much damage. It can cause so much damage. People think the money is the answer to everything, and it's actually it's like an incendiary device. It is dangerous because if you pitch people against each other without knowing the connections, you again damage infrastructure. You cut communities down the middle, and that we have to be much more sophisticated in that. And you have to be more humble in your leadership, and you have to be able to turn around and say, I'm not going to do that way. And that for me is the really important bit about modern compassionate leadership that enables us to get to a closer relationship with our communities and greater levels of trust. Everything in my world could be monitored by the 4-hour target in A&E. That's not the indicator of a well community. It's a complete falsehood. It's actually demand failure. We should not be looking to that. Some of these things are so difficult to count sometimes about the interventions that you have to grow a social movement so that there's more than you just saying it's having a positive impact. You have to get the stories out. If your system is just designed to make decisions on data that has been manipulated in a way to answer a specific question, you'll always stay in the way you've always stayed. So you have to assess that.
Yeah, no, that is. I've got more. I'm going to pause because I know Stuart is like going, "Let me in, Jace. I want to add to this conversation." So, Pam, I'm going to come back actually because I know there's some questions bubbling without a shadow of a doubt. Stuart, I guess this is music to your ears about the work you do through Achieve, Thrive, and Flourish, Stuart. So I'm really keen to hear your contribution to kind of what you've heard from Cormac and from Pam.
Thank you, Jason. And as Pam echoed earlier on, just the fact that we've been given the opportunity to, the key word being trust from leaders. It works both ways as well. Trust in the community, but as a locally trusted organisation, the trust that I've been given through leaders to go in and make mistakes, to try different projects to see what works, and just being allowed that space to develop and grow as a locally trusted organisation has been so impactful for us. So many of the slides that Cormac reflected on such a deep relevance to the work that we're doing, and at times it's been overwhelming to see. You take theory 5 years ago at the beginning of the LDP journey. Like, can this work? Will this work? Can we really do this work in this way? And seeing it grow over the last 5 years has been, it's just been an amazing journey for us. And I think where we've managed to anchor communities and to build that trust, first of all, leaders have given us trust, and then we've been able to build trust in the communities because of that. So this new way of working has meant that we've been able to develop communities in our underserved areas, and it's not really relevant what the program is that we're trying to deliver, because it's about friendships, it's about social connections, so that then when we land programs, for example, when we started off working in Felmores in Pitsea, we were about going where the strength is, and there was a school that opened the doors, and they kind of got out of the way. They wanted to deliver the curriculum. They're an amazing school. They still are. They're still one of our really strongest partners. We work so well together. But they got out of the way, and they allowed us to work with young people and their families who are at risk of being excluded, allowing them to focus more on the curriculum. And that was the partnership that we agreed. And then the success of that, the discovery days, as Pam's alluded to, where we're able to kind of go in and again focus with the community on what's strong in the area. Where are the sticky people that we all look for? The absolute, what do we do without them? And I still think systems as a whole don't understand what finding the people that bring 30 people with them to a program, and that's their personality and that's their nature. They still don't get what skills and qualities they are, and I think there's still work to think about that, because those are the people that we're looking for. because we want to do meaningful work. So you find those people and you bring them together, and then you start to gather communities. So it had a profound effect on the local area. We reclaimed spaces that the public felt were not safe, the local park as the example. And I often reflect back on this, but as someone who's got a background of a local authority, I heard that the work was going really well there, and that we were beginning to gather momentum, and that these sessions, LDP, so line of sight of always of physical activity, but really about building social connections. I went down to the park one day and found over 100 people there, and this was happening 2 or 3 times a week. So this is working. That was the moment that I really realized that something's different here. Things, the conditions that we're creating are bringing about connections and making significant changes. So that first wave of volunteers, that first wave of people, of the sticky people, have been, from that first discovery we did in Felmore's, I'd say 50% of our staff came from that discovery day, just coming and sharing passions. And so then we began to think, well, if it can work in education, why can't it work in health? So let's go and, again, because of the network that Jason and the guys have built, Active Basildon, Active Essex, the LDP, we're able to have access to Pam. Pam's able to meet some of our volunteers and be moved and get the vision and what we're trying to achieve. And then, so if we can do this work in an education setting, we can do it in a health setting as well. I'm sure we can. So what's the priorities for education? Well, the priorities for education is reducing exclusion, helping young people stay in school. What's the priorities for Pam? Reducing GP appointments, focusing on frequent flyers to the GP surgery. So let's repeat what we're doing. Let's use our practice of change, but this time with a different focus. So we're doing, I guess we're kind of doing unofficial social prescribing with the emphasis on the community holding the capacity. So we're not just signposting, we're referring people into our community. And so then if we're in a health setting and we're in an education setting, let's go and be in a youth offending setting, all within the same area. If people aren't coming along to our community sessions because they're on the fringes, then we'll go to where they are and we'll invite them into our community. So over time, as I said earlier, we've built programs. So the system now probably understand. We've got a lot better at speaking the system's language, because why wouldn't you? Because let's face it, that's where we need to unlock the funding. But principally, what we're doing is building communities, and I think if you can build these kind of obviously you have to go where the strength is, where there's partners. So it looks different in different areas, but by building that now, systems knitting, you're knitting systems partners together. So you're working upwards to bring systems partners together to then kind of have this kind of, it's like putting the pieces of the puzzle together, and the heart of it is the community. And what the community see is friendships, is resilience, is companionship. And then we're able to then land systems programs into those communities. So I'm confident that we can land programs because I know that we've got that trust in that community.
God, Stuart, you've done it as well now. I want you to carry on talking as well. That's absolutely brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. And the thing for me, Stuart, you talked about, which this is exactly where we're feeling ourselves at Active Essex, actually, on the journey that you've just described, is that it's not about programs. You said it's about friendships, social connections. It's about bringing people together, and then multiple things will come, but it's not starting with, I need to deliver this program, isn't it? Just expand on that, because that's a bit of old school, isn't it? The old school was that you'd be given funding to do a 6-week or 12-week thing, which is very, I suppose, we call transactional. But what you're saying is actually there's some conditions that you need to create, hence why we're calling these creating the conditions. And you've just described it, haven't you? Just expand on that for me. I think that's what you're saying, aren't you? You're saying these conditions you need to create, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess I go back to, as I alluded to earlier on, the discovery days, where we're first of all identifying a partner finding a space where we can have, find connections, find community members that have an interest and a passion, and they're already there. There's always a network, there's always the clubs, there's always the associations, as Cormac alluded to earlier on. So you're not asking people to do anything different. Just come with your passions and then start making them to connect, build that framework, build that trust within the community. And then you're right. So what was the Discovery Day about? It was about building a program of events that the community were interested in. The problem was a park that was unsafe, there was a perception of fear around that the green space wasn't for them. But we didn't talk about the park. We talked about people's hobbies, their interests and their passions. And then from that was the first group of volunteers that have become our staff and over time. And that was by empowering them, giving them the opportunity in a really safe environment to kind of practice their strengths, to see if their idea for programs worked. And it was always about, okay, we'll give it 6 weeks, we'll see if we can get interest, we'll see if we can get people along to this stuff, and we'll go with you. And if it isn't quite right, then we'll work something different. So yeah, I think the LDP was the perfect conditions because you allowed us to try. And what the goal was about getting people from underserved communities, who were inactive, getting them more active. So that was a broad remit to allow us to kind of try that out. And that then helped us to kind of understand, well, this is about building connections and friendships. So that now, because that work's been done, when the mental health community project comes along for a tea time club, or like I said, the social prescribing opportunity comes along, we know that the community's there so that we can build into that. So it doesn't feel overwhelming or a challenge to start new projects, because you've got a network that's built up. And so we can just land your aspirations now. That's the point of this, right? And that's how we've still got so much work to do for the system to understand this is the way to work. And sorry, I'm going to say something more. I'm going to stop you. But it's kind of like, why would you not want to work in this way, right? Forget everything else, because at the end of the day, I didn't start to come and be a chief exec or whatever else. I came because I wanted to build community and to have a sense of purpose in my life, right? And I've got that in spades now, And so why would you not want your work to be meaningful and to make a difference? So that's where you start. So whatever, and I reflected this earlier on this week, whatever the funding situation looks like, up, down, things are going well, things are going not, you've still got a community that you're part of and you belong with, and you see no difference, but you're just embedded and part of that community. So that's why you should work in this way.
And sure, that comes out so strongly in every conversation I've ever had with you, that passion actually, and I'm sure people on this call here today have actually got that kind of passion as well. We had a question actually, so we're going to start to play back and move about, and bear with me, but I think I saw a question in actually which you've answered, which was Sarah asked about Discovery Days and absolutely asked about what they're made up of, and you did that, you perfectly answered that. I think for me also, I'm bringing Cormac in now, the Discovery Days, Cormac, are a little bit about, again, going back to your 4Ds, we are recognising that we're moving out of the way, and we're giving that space that you talked about earlier on, didn't you, about the opportunity for people to create the ideas themselves. I think that's what we're doing, aren't we? We're creating those ideas. Stuart, Cormac, would you agree? Help me out here.
Yeah, totally. One of the challenges, and I think Stuart's kind of unpacking this, and Pam did as well, is in order to move into a discovery modality, you've got to recognize that if you're locked into a custom and practice, which is about a delivery modality, a choice has to be made. Doing the two together will just pull your system apart, and it will come across as incongruent to the people who are receiving. So one thing will cancel the other out. So if you want to do delivery, you've kind of got to live with the consequences of that. And sometimes it's the right way to go, typically if you're in a crisis. But discovery is really done by people who have a view that the community has something to offer. So it sort of challenges values as well. And typically, if staff and leadership believe that the community have something worth contributing, then they'll almost naturally spend more time in discovery. So there's something I think about just having that conversation. How do we actually see our communities? Do we see them as a pool of needs? Do we see them as a pool of sickness? Do we see them as inactive? Or are we seeing people who actually may well be overwhelmed or traumatized and struggling with poverty, and as well as that, also have a huge amount to give? So let's go discover what that is and what they care about. So I think for those that are thinking about the conditions, and I saw a question about the conditions, sometimes the conditions actually, ironically, may start within your own organization. So I think is like, do we run an organization where people get to play to their own strengths? Do we run an organization where if people want to take some time off to do something in their own community and they come from Essex, that's encouraged because their citizenship matters as much as their specialism? Do we work in an organization where people can say no and there's a culture of dissent as well as just going along to get along? I think those are the organizations that get that the value of discovery in communities has to actually be lived. It's not a performative act, is my point. You can't just go and do a 2-day workshop and go and do it. And I think not alone what we're hearing, yes, there's a massive amount of passion in what Stuart and Pam have said. I also think there's a lot of integrity. And this takes authenticity and integrity as well.
Absolutely, it does actually. I'm going to start diving in actually some really interesting questions actually, and I suppose you slightly just touched on that, Cormac, for me because there's a comment actually I really appreciate the comment around is this creating conditions program, and is it kind of a different kind of program? And I suppose I was curious that Stuart started talking about this is a way of working. It's a way of working, and I suppose just to expand on it, keen to hear from all three of you actually about are we talking about a program or are we talking about a way of working, something we're trying to hardwire? Actually, I'd be keen to hear. And Pam, maybe you want to start us off actually because you've shown some brave leadership in this space. I'm going to come back to leadership as well, but Pam, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think it is a cultural journey. It's an absolute cultural journey, and stopping habits and habitual processes requires a intervention. And the intervention I chose when I moved to a new area was I bought my team Cormac's book. And I said, whatever you do over Christmas, take some time to read this book because this is how I'm going to lead. This is the way that we're going to do business going forward. This is the culture that I'm creating, and looking at communities not as the problem, looking at communities as the bed of entrepreneurs and solutions and magical, colourful opportunities that we must not damage, was a very intentional act. And I think we have to be more intentional. And if you talk to anyone about injustice and democracy and inequity from a racial perspective, you have to be purposeful and you have to be intentional to make a difference. So it is a culture, and it's a culture of inclusion that and authenticity that drives this, and being open-minded to and not finding yourself ever playing into those stereotypes of a community. You have to absolutely stand tall about that. You have to, because you have to see the magical amount of impact that Stuart's team have had on the community. No statutory organisation has been able to do, and we cannot afford, actually, being completely honest, to pay for every single interaction. You have to have a flourishing set of conversations to support the journey that you're going on. And Luke's put some questions in the chat about engagement. And actually, I have to be the recipient of the good, the bad, and the ugly out of those things. And I have to take that on board, and I have to change. And I cannot listen to communities but do nothing. So you've got to put the value. If you're going to start it, you have to absolutely see it through. And I guess COVID taught me a lot about that. I had the privilege of working directly into communities through COVID, and I think now our challenge is single common purpose directly into communities, delivering but understanding why vaccination rates were low in communities is absolutely not about the physical building is in the wrong place. Like, unless you understand slavery, unless you understand about German culture post-war, you will not understand the full picture of vaccinating. And it's our job as leaders to be intelligent in our leadership from that perspective. And you only get that by learning and listening to communities. I don't have the opportunity to be hugely well read. I have a 7-year-old, I go to all these leadership things and they say, and what are you reading at the moment? I have Cormac Russell's book right by my bed. I have to refer to, I have outcome-based accountability, but I also have Peter Rabbit and I have phonics and I have things like that. So my capacity is consumed. That's the reality of being a parent. But what I do think is that we lead in every capacity that we're in, and if we can make small changes, we can have a massive impact, not just on our working life, but in our own communities. And that, I can draw on experiences that Cormac's training has given me in my own personal life. And once you start to resonate like that, you can't depart from it. Yeah. And you've got to make it resonate for everybody in your teams that you're leading. And it's different for everybody, but that has to be your aim as a leader.
No, brilliant. That's brilliant. Stuart, and then Cormac. Stuart, you touched on the fact of the way of working actually, and less of a program. You explain. Yeah, do you want to expand on that? Are you comfortable in that space?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of, one of the advantages we've had is we're building from scratch. We're not an established organisation, so we're able to set the conditions right. So our values have evolved over time, and their values have been based on the personalities and the people that we have found that have driven our programs forward. How can we replicate this? How can we find more of these personality types to drive this work forward? So we are talking about integrity and people holding the values of what we're doing. It's not about ego, it's about the community, it's not about ourselves. And so people that get that and understand that tend to be able to drive the program forward. And I think also, that being allowed to get things wrong, again, from leaders, from funders, I think that's been so helpful and so powerful. It's okay to get comfortable with the chaos. It's okay to get things wrong, hold your nerve. These principles that we've learned, and it's a bit like a cult. It's a positive cult, but we see people referring and speaking in these phrases again and again, because these are the things that hold you during difficult times, when things don't go right, when staff members don't quite live up to when partners and projects don't quite work out how you have the strength to carry on, because it is a way of working and a way of living that helps to drive communities forward and to give people, our charity, basically, boil it all down, it's about raising aspirations and building resilience for young people and their families. That's what we do, and it's kind of those principles that hold us and drive us forward.
Brilliant. I'm going to pause that one because I think we've answered that really, really well. There's 2 questions in actually from someone called Emily actually, which I'm fascinated by actually. And I'm going to come to Cormac first actually, Cormac, because our first question is about leadership, which we'll come back to because I want you all to answer that. But the particular one that interested me greatly was that how do we demonstrate to institutions and system leaders the value of allowing space for community power, when so much of our approach is around, it needs to be through the challenge of inadequate measurements and quantitative style targets, which is a thing actually, Cormac. We're in public sector, we're having to demonstrate the impact of what we do and why we do it. Actually, sometimes this work doesn't immediately give us that, does it actually, I suppose? How do we approach that? What's our narrative that we should be thinking about, Cormac? And you've seen this all around the world, so I'd love your answer to this, please, help me.
Yeah, I think sometimes what ends up happening is we become so focused on the job at hand that it's easy to miss the reason why this makes so much common sense. Think about it even, the fact that we have an 8-hour day. Where did that come from? Did that come from institutions? No, it came from people organizing, forming into collaboratives. In a sense, trade unions and otherwise helped. But even trade unions, what is that? It's a community of people with common interests, common affiliation. Why do we have universal suffrage? Because women sacrificed a huge amount to actually make it so. Why do people get holidays? All of these things were not just bestowed upon us by the good graces of, a monarch or an institution. A lot of them were fought very hard for from the grassroots up. A lot of what we understand today as good public health actually didn't just emerge from the great science and insight of great leaders, but also from a lot of community participation. And so I think in a lot of ways, also within our systems, I've often said, leaders talk about the importance of relocating authority to some of the more frontline staff. And, issues of trust surface. Say, if you actually even just think about this from the perspective of your organization, if you're a leader, and you look at the amount of workarounds and goodwill that people bring to their work, which if they stopped bringing to their work would grind your organization to a halt. And there's a very clear test of that if you ever had the gumption to do a real test on this. It's called, in trade unionism, it's called work to rule. And we see this. So work to rule basically is I will only do what it says in my job spec that I'm supposed to do. Now, technically, if that was enough, well, then our institution should be tickety-boo, should be flying. Like, why would that be a problem? Surely that's what the social contract is. But no, in all kinds of ways, people bring their heart and their soul and their creativity and a lot of extra hours and lots of commitment. The same thing is true in communities. But largely in communities, it is invisible because we have backgrounded the power of communities and we've foregrounded the power of institutions. So the question is right on point, I think. And so the answer in part is, how can we reverse that polarity? That's what we're hearing from Pam and Stuart. Ways of reversing the polarity and say, I think our job, and it won't just happen, it actually actively has to be done, is to make some concerted effort around saying, currently, democracy is inverted. The role of community is defined as that which happens after the important work of institutions and professionals is done. That's the reality. But that's not democracy. That's technocracy. Look at what's happening in America in reaction to technocracy. It's really dangerous. And I don't think, I don't think we're far behind, quite honestly, with the level of distrust. In a democracy, the role of the professional should be defined as that which happens after the important work of citizens is done. That's the idea, that in a democracy, the citizen is at the center. But if we're not actually doing the work to help citizens actually get organized into communities, then of course we're going to end up carrying the baby. Now, I think the reason that, just to go back to the question, that some folks may actually say, you know what, we have to move in this direction is because it's the level of crisis or crisis, in the plural sense, is becoming so significant that the platform is burning. So I've worked with very senior leaders in a lot of public sector organizations around the world, and just think of one at the moment in Ontario. So in Ontario, it's a province, one of 10 provinces in Canada. 2.2 million people do not have access to a GP. I could just let that settle for a minute. That is phenomenal. There are areas in Canada where after COVID, they can't recruit doctors. They can't retain staff. And this isn't just in health, it's right across the board. So I think in this instance, it's interesting because also in our work, in areas where the community development we've been talking about has been done, outcomes are better. The demand on the system reduces in an ethical way. And so, I think to an extent, what we probably have to do is create the space for folks that maybe are a little bit resistant to actually get out. Seeing is believing sometimes. So actually getting out into communities and seeing some of these initiatives is as important as these kinds of workshops that we're doing here, because that's what happened in Leeds. When the senior directors actually said, not alone are we asking our staff to have all the non-private meetings in communities, we're actually going to go and do the same thing. And the actual act of holding themselves to account and getting out of their map of what they think communities are and into the actual territory had a massive transformative effect. So that nearly won the argument far more than having the argument, if that makes sense. Because, and I'll stop here, I don't think we can think our way into this. I think we have to act our way into this. This is about practice, and it's about getting out of our institutions, that decentralizing piece again, and actually getting into communities and really being curious.
That's absolutely brilliant. And I think cheekily, I'll just add that actually, in answer to that, community power is, I suppose for me, a simple principle as you've described there, Cormac. Actually, communities have that valuable insight into their own circumstances. So actually, if we take the time, particularly in the kind of the constraints we currently have around resources and rising demand and that whole kind of capacity change that we have, we need to augment that with the power of communities as being active participants and not passive. And you've heard that from Pam, we've heard that from Stuart. And actually, if we get that right then, Cormac, we will see the targets and the impact achieved because we've gone about it doing it the right way and not continuing it to do it, I suppose, in the challenging way that we find ourselves in, because ultimately we're not going to get any further, really, I suppose. So I think that's kind of quite absolutely fascinating. I want to bring in another piece here now because I just realised that we're flying in time, and this is about leadership, because actually someone's asking about, and I always had it on my list to ask the three of you about, I suppose, what is the future need of modern leadership? Because to do this, are we looking for, are we needing a different breed of leader or leadership to kind of create this kind of culture and behaviours of what we're talking about, actually? And so I want to start with Pam, because Pam's nodding at me, actually. I see Pam in this space because you're being brave. You're being brave, Pam. You're taking this in a brave way. So what do you think some of the components are that are needed in this space?
So if I reflect on my leadership career, and I've probably told some of you this before, but when I first started on Aspiring Directors course 20 years ago, I was coached through McKinsey's, one of the top five accountancy firms, and I was taken from a clinician to be someone that was absolutely focused on. I mean, we were made to read a book then called Getting to Yes. It was so kind of aggressively corporate that it was just about processes and leading through processes. There was nothing humanistic about it at all. Now, that's not to say I don't need probity around finance, and I don't need to be able to analyze data, and I need all of those things as well, and I'm grateful for the schooling that I got in that time. But as I've matured, I've realized that this is so much more about human leadership and humility and authenticity, and actually not being conditioned as a female to be more male, or a male to be very aggressive when they're much more sensitive in their thought processes. There's more than one way, and I think that the leadership opportunities that I've had since the LDP and Sport England arrived in Essex have been my defining leadership opportunities, and they are about inclusion, democracy, about communities, about asset and understanding. And it wasn't that I was starting from scratch, because as a clinician I'd worked in communities. I'd seen how communities came together around, stroke is my particular clinical speciality. I'd seen how communities go together. I grew up in a small village where I used to put the bin out as a girl doing a paper round, and I felt safe enough to do that, but I was schooled to do those sorts of things. So it's not that I was starting from a zero, but I want to be able to be a leader that brings in those morals that I live out in the rest of my life to my workplace and the work that I do. And I feel that unless we address that, making statements about we want all our staff to bring themselves to work without really understanding what that means. You have to create a culture of psychological safety first. One. So having an organisation that disagrees with itself is the healthiest thing you can have. And you have to, as a leader, recognise when you're getting too quickly to a decision. And you have to be brave enough to say, stop. We're papering over things here. We're going to cause damage. And that, for me, is always the point, is if I withdrew from funding something tomorrow, what would be the impact? And you have to always have that challenge to yourself to say, are we creating dependency? Have we thought through it enough? Do we know do we really know what we're doing here? And that culture of leadership is essential, absolutely essential, because if you don't take your people with you, you lose your capacity. And you lose your capacity for change. And people very quickly in an organisation, as remote as you think your decision makings are to people's lives, will become impacted. And that's just within your own organisation. So you absolutely have to resonate that with communities as well. So yeah, being brave, being known, being able to be challenged. I'd hope that my community providers would know that who I am and would see me, standing shoulder to shoulder with Stuart and not being in an ivory tower. You have to break that.
No, that's absolutely brilliant. And Stuart, from your perspective, you talked about ways of working. You've talked about the amazing stuff you're doing at ATF. Tell us, you've got a blueprint now. Tell us what is the future needs of a modern leader? What does that look like? What are we asking for?
I think I'd echo everything that Pam said there. She covered a number of points, but I was also just reflecting on what we're doing and the fact that we're building foundations collectively for this way of working. And it's relatively early days for us in Essex, and I think part of our aspirations are that the system understands and embeds this work that we're doing. But I think if we're all honest, the system's not quite there yet. And as a leader, I have a responsibility to reflect the work that we're doing and to speak systems language better, so that I can, while we're trying to build momentum and change, that we can make the programs that we're working reflect systems priorities, so that they understand they're kind of catching up with us in some ways, but get them to understand how we're doing things differently, but still reflecting where they are at in their journey. And I think that's a big responsibility, because as much progress as we've made, there's still lots more to do, and in uncertain times as well. So by speaking systems language better as a leader, then I'm representing the people that I know and I'm proud to work with in our communities.
And I suppose one of the critical things that we've picked up this afternoon, and you've spoken about, all of you, in different ways, is about trust. Actually, you've all talked about the importance of trust to the progress moves at speed of trust, as Pam said earlier. I suppose, how do we gain trust then? Trust from our senior leaders to trust us to do what we've just described, and also, therefore, second part of the question, trust in our communities. Cormac, I'll start with you. What is it that we need to be able to do those things for me?
Yeah, and it's kind of bi-directional things. So the question is, how do we get an alignment whereby the institution trusts that not alone do community have needs, but they're also needed? So you're much more likely to trust others if you really recognize that you're interdependent, that you can't do this without them. Otherwise, it's just, are you a nice person? And we need something more significant, more strategic, more durable than that. And I think one of the ways that we take risks in trust, because sometimes to build trust, particularly across fault lines, takes courage. And it requires risks, and sometimes, and maybe often actually, in order to create bridges of trust, you've got to be prepared to challenge the status quo. because there might be all kinds of mainstream arguments as to why you shouldn't trust the community. It's so disorganized, it's so random, it's so illegible, so hard to control, so hard to measure, so hard to standardize. Can we scale it up? I mean, you just hear this over and over again. These are questions of trust. So the reason you know they're questions of trust is because when you give logical answers, the logical answers don't seem to land. Well, that tells me that these are emotional questions, not logical ones. And so I think the trust grows really when we're prepared to get in relationship and get alongside people. And people don't care what we know until they know that we care. So another piece, and it's links with leadership, I'll finish on this. There, in every dynamic between institutions and communities, something is being assigned and something is being assumed. You can literally take that to the bank, but most of the time it is behind the curtain. It's behind a veil, and we don't know what it is because we're not talking about power openly enough. When trust is really there and when it grows, it's when people talk honestly about power, and they're actually saying, we have to negotiate a social contract here. We have to work this out and figure out what it is that you can do, what it is we can do with the right amount of support together, and what it is you need done for us. That's the social contract that trust allows us to renegotiate. I often think of it, Jason, as like a 3-lane swimming pool, where in every issue, there's certain things communities can do themselves if we remove the participation barriers and, the silly bureaucracy that gets in the way often. In the second lane, there's things that they can do themselves, but they can do more of because we're there collaboratively supporting them. And as Stuart and Pam is saying, that's not about ego, that's about eco. It's about us moving into more ecologically sound ways of working and trusting each other. So you really trust community if you can get behind them rather than say, I know what's best for you, follow me. So that's not trust. And then I think the third lane is community have to be prepared and really trust us to say, here's what we need done for us, and we trust you to do it. So there's enough mutual alliance. And that's the key piece. We all want our expertise to be used. We all want to be good public servants. But largely, we won't be able to be effective in our jobs until we're affective in our relationships with our communities. And that's the final thing, We're trying to solve an awful lot of issues that we think are technical. They're not. They're relational. They're about trust.
Wow. Oh, I'm loving this. I'm loving this. Pam, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is much I can add to that, to be honest, because trust is so important. And I suppose the one big message that I give is humility. So
Yeah.
you gotta be humble. You've got to be a humble leader. You've got to know when you don't know, to be able to work differently, and that isn't a sign of weakness. That's a sign of there's so much to know, and it's complex, and it's systems change. It is complicated because of the micro infrastructure and the rhizome kind of way that our communities work. I love the view of the wood wide web. In fact, there's a tree that services others, and it's not other trees, it's all sorts of other things, and our ecosystem in our communities is like that, and you can't possibly know it all. So just be humble, and the minute you're humble, people will talk to you and they'll share with you. If you go in with your badge expecting a response, forget it. Like, literally forget. I mean, most of the time I don't use my title. I'm embarrassed actually of my title in a way, because what would it mean to anybody? Like, most of the people don't know the organisation that I work for. What on earth do I think that's going to create in trust terms in somebody else's life? It's going to mean nothing. So don't think that that's going to get you in the door. Go in, humble, listen, positive action, come back, follow up, do the things that you would do the way you want your family to be treated. Don't think of it as any more complicated than that, because actually you've in your own life you've got all the answers. That's why physiotherapy is something I love, because actually I carry an anatomy book around with me constantly, don't I? The answer is there. But being visible, stepping into the arena, I think is something that we have to do.
Stuart, last bit. Trust, therefore, I looked at a formula while you were both all through talking, and it talked about credibility and reliability. Are those two things, to finish this question off, and I'm suppose I'm going to have to wrap up after this, that ATF absolutely are able to demonstrate on your journey?
I believe so. Yes, I feel that we have credibility in that we've proven that we don't parachute in. The community are ATF. The people in the community are ATF, and reliability. I think Pam just said it, didn't she? You know, if you say you're gonna do something, do it. Be there. Always be there, no matter what. And that's what builds trust. And then, you know, it's that goodwill account, isn't it? If you deposit stuff into someone's goodwill account, they'll pay it back, and that's what you're looking to try and achieve.
Do you know what? I could carry on talking to all three of you for the rest of the afternoon, but unfortunately time has run us out. And I suppose it's just a massive thank you to all three of you for what you've just done in the hour and a half that we spent together. A huge thank you, Cormac. I can listen to you all day with your thought leadership. Absolutely love it, and I'm really applying it to what I'm trying to do here in Essex with the great amount of people that we work with. Pam, you know, we're committed to work across system settings, and it's great to have a leader like yourself, even though you don't like being called that, but you are, because you're absolutely advocating this kind of way of working. So a massive thank you. And Stuart, just anchoring us back to the importance of actually you doing it in communities and seeing the results of what you do. And that's the really important bit. I absolutely recognise, not about me sitting there with my shirt on, but the fact that you are out there connecting in the communities and seeing what you call sticky people, real people absolutely changing their lives. It's just so powerful. So a massive thank you. Apologise, we didn't get to everyone's question, but a commitment from Active Essex. We will pick up a conversation with you outside of this session, so my team are collecting the details and we will absolutely pick that up with you. So huge thank you. It's just to say that we'll be back in touch with any resources to share, and also just to say that this was the second in our Correcting the Condition series. We have two more left actually, so please do have a look on our website. The next one is around creating the conditions around hardwiring physical activity with a devolution focus. I'm delighted colleagues from Manchester are going to be joining us around the work they're doing in Manchester. And then our final ones, that's on the 20th of March. And then the final one on the 26th of March is around leadership. And we touched on that today. And I'm delighted that Cam Creever, a good friend of ours, will talk about some of the skills and ideas around fearless leadership in this ever-changing world that we're in now. So all it leaves me to say is a massive thank you. Take care. We're committed to this at Active Essex. We look forward to working with you on this ongoing journey. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, and never underestimate your impact, Jason, either.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely brilliant. So I really do appreciate your time. I'll be back in touch. You know I will. Thank you very much.
I'm not riding 100 miles again. Just
no, I won't let you do that. Don't worry. Trust me.
Thanks for giving us the opportunity. I really appreciate it, you know, and I really do mean that, you know, like the trust you guys have given to me, like that's why I'm able to sit here and say what I do. So I really appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.